Well, I'd like to welcome everybody again to the next Congregation Bethel talk, and I'm very pleased and honored to be able to do this. What we're going to do tonight is take a virtual tour of Bank Street, basically a walking tour, because I've led actual in-person tours, which is a lot of fun and probably maybe more fun than this. I don't know. But at least we'll all save ourselves some energy tonight, and we don't have to even worry about the weather. So, and plus, we'll get to see everything that we need to see. Now, for some of you folks, for many of you folks, you long-term New Londoners, this will be a real trip down memory lane because I'm going to speak about, of course, what's there now, but also what's been there in the past. And I will especially focus on the many businesses and business owners that were Jewish and belonged to Bethel or other congregations, but there were a lot of business folks on Bank Street. Now, we can't talk about Bank Street without talking about the whaling industry. New London is the whaling city. That's our nickname. Well, Bank Street was the center of all the whaling activity in the 1800s. And as you probably know, New London was the second busiest whaling port in the world, first being New Bedford, Massachusetts. Now, it sounds like whaling was kind of a gruesome business and a very difficult business, but it was necessary because you needed the whale oil. They didn't have alternatives in those days. You needed the oil to light the lamps in your homes, to light the street lamps. And what they did is they boiled down the blubber from the whales to gather the oil. And so basically the whaling ships were seagoing factories, oil factories. And the success of any voyage was determined on how many barrels of oil you brought back. Now, New London had so many whaling ships, whaling companies, and we're going to talk about that tonight. But the peak was in 1845, when in our harbor, we had 81 whaling vessels. And also, it was, all the businesses and the companies that were associated with that. Now, this all started to die down in 1859 when they discovered oil in the ground in Pennsylvania. The first oil well was dug in Titusville, Pennsylvania that year. And with that, from those years on, especially during the Civil War and afterwards, the whole whaling business started to slow down. And basically, if you really want to learn about the whole whaling industry, the best place in the area, and I have to say, is the Mystic Seaport Museum, where they have the last real wooden whaling ship on Earth, the Charles W. Morgan, that was built in 1840 at the height of the whaling days. And they also have a building, which unfortunately is closed right now, where you can spend an hour learning everything about the whaling industry. So the next question is, well, let me bring up my slides here. Just give me a second. I'm going to screen share and hopefully this is going to work. Where does it say? Wait a minute. Where does it say? Wait a minute. 1 second. Oh, here it is. Present. Okay. So here is a ship at one of the many wharfs in New London getting ready for their travels on their big sailing voyages. And these voyages could go from 3 months to a year. You see all the barrels lined up on the pier. That was what will be used and filled on their whaling voyage. Now, in the early days, let's say the 1800s, look at all the wharves in New London. I mean, here's Water Street right here. That's Water Street, but here's Bank Street. I mean, it was just loaded with wharves. And this top picture is from 1934. You can still see plenty of the piers right off of Water Street. By the lower picture is relatively recent, and obviously they've taken down many of the old words. But, you wonder too, with the whole whaling story, were there any Jews involved? In New London, I don't think so. I mean, other than telling the story of Jonah and the whale, if you remember from my talk last week, the Jews were just starting to arrive here in the 1860s, 1870s, at the same time that whaling was dying off. So I don't think there are any Jews involved in New London's whaling history. But in New Bedford, the Portuguese Jews had been there for years before that, and they were involved in many of the side businesses associated with whaling. Now, we're here to talk about Bank Street. By the way, let me throw a couple quick facts at you folks. Bank Street is named for the riverbank. It runs along the bank. It doesn't have anything to do with the financial institutions. And also in 1844, at the height of the whaling industry, the whaling business, the Bank Street was the first street in New London to be graded. What they had to do was they had to cover over all the foundations from many of the burnt out buildings, maybe even from Benedict Arnold's days. But anyhow, they had plenty of foundations that they had to cover over with dirt and what have you so they can grade it. So the actual street was raised 8 feet higher than normal. So if you ever walk along Bank Street and you look toward the water, you notice there's a big slope heading down. That's not a natural slope. That was created in 1844 when they really built the street. So, and, as I've been talking about, Bank Street's always been a big part of the New London maritime history. We had the whaling men in the 1800s. And then in the 1900s came all the sailors. You had the sub base, the Coast Guard Academy, and the street was packed with sailors, starting especially in World War II. But even if you guys remember, the USS Fulton, the submarine tender that was home ported at State Pier, I mean, that also contributed a lot of naval presence to New London and specifically Bank Street. The Fulton had a crew, officers and men, of 1,200 people. So that was a lot of naval presence in New London. Now, I can also tell you, and you already know this, but Bank Street did not have the greatest reputation in the 60s and 70s. Maybe because of all the sailors or what have you. But the street was filled with rowdy bars, drunken sailors, prostitutes, seedy rooming houses. It wasn't a very nice place. But during the daytime, there were legitimate businesses on Bank Street. I mean, many, and we'll talk about all those. But at nighttime, it was a very different place. Now, compare that to State Street, which was the commercial, the financial center of New London, with many professional offices also, very different than Bank Street. And also, you folks will remember, more so than I, that Bank Street was originally a two-way street. So you had parking on both sides, traffic in both directions, and you had a trolley running down the middle of the street. I don't know how they squeezed it all in. Obviously, the sidewalks were much more narrow. But here, this picture is from 1953. And I want to point out, I think they're putting in some sewers. You can see over in this area how the cobblestones have been covered over by paving, sometime in the past. Now, a few things in this picture I want to point out. This is the store on the corner, which in the 50s here is Whalen Drugs. In my day, I would know that as Roz's Delicatessen. But basically, it's Whalen Drugs. On the other side of the street, this is Subway, of course, in recent days. For many years, it was the corner luncheonette because it was on the corner of State Street. The one thing I'm going to point out to you, and I'll talk about in a second, can you see where it says Elmore Shoes, the second building in behind Whalen Drugs, Elmore Shoes? I just want to show you that so that we can talk about it in a moment or two. Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit. This building's not on Bank Street. This is around the corner. This is the building directly across from the train station. Again, many restaurants were there over the days, but it's on State Street between Water and Bank. This building was put up in 1844 as the warehouse and ship's chandlery for the Perkins and Smith whaling firm. Now, you're going to hear me use the term chandlery a few times. The chandlery is a store that supplies all the needs for a ship. It basically outfits the ship for their voyages. And you can get all your equipment there, your food, one-stop shopping. So think of it like the Walmart of the whaling days. So this building was put up as a whaling headquarters, so to speak. Well, when after whaling died off, it became a hotel. It became the Winthrop Hotel. So if you look over the door frame right here, you'll see where it says the Winthrop Hotel, and that existed for a bunch of years. And that actually started in 1889 at that point. Now, next I'm going to talk about the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. This was given as a gift by the Lawrence family. Now, Joseph Lawrence came to New London around 1830 or so as Giuseppe Lorenzo. He was an immigrant from Italy that came to New London and started a whaling firm that became quite successful. He became a very wealthy man. He was actually able to retire by 1845. But it is this Joseph Lawrence that gave the money to start the Lawrence Free Hospital, which today is L&M. And his sons took over the business and ran it very well into the 1900s. So here, at the base of the statue, it says it's presented to their native city by the sons of Joseph Lawrence, 1896. They were very proud of their work. I mean, they're very proud of New London and wanted to give back as much as possible. And again, we'll talk about that further in a moment. So now what we're going to do, oh, and there's a picture of Sebastian Lawrence. I don't have any of Joseph Lawrence, but that's his son, Sebastian, who ran the business. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start on one side of Bank Street, walk down for a bit, and then switch to the other side. Now, remember the Whalen drugstore, Roz's Delicatessen, which, by the way, was not owned by a Jewish person, I don't believe. But basically, at one point in the 60s, it was Katz's Menswear. Now, this was owned by a fellow named Samuel Katz, and maybe you guys can fill me in on it, but I really couldn't find too much about Samuel Katz. But he ran this men's store on the corner. Now, next door is this building. This building, you know, in recent decades as Klingerman Travel. But as I mentioned before, excuse me a second, folks. As I mentioned before, this was Elmore Shoes. And Elmore Shoes was owned by a fellow named Carl Charloff. Carl Charloff was the father of Naomi Radcliffe, a long-term, very dear member of Congregation Bethel. So that was her father's store. Now, in talking with Mark Schneider, one thing I learned is that in this store, when he went into the store to buy shoes, they had a machine where you put the shoe on, stuck it in the machine, and it took an X-ray of your feet while the shoe salesman was looking in the machine to see how it fit, to make sure there were no bunions, nothing was rubbing. And here's a picture of the machine. It was called a shoe fitting fluoroscope. Remember, a fluoroscope is a live X-ray, not just taking snapshots, but a live X-ray. And of course, I think this faded out after a while when people realized the dangers of radiation. So anyhow, that was Elmore Shoes. Next door is the building you all know as the Marcus store, the Marcus casual clothing, jeans, what have you, that was owned by Sam Rubenstein. Now, excuse me a second, folks. Wait a minute. So now, but long before it was Marcus, this building played a very significant role in New London's history. The business before Marcus, by the way, way back when, was something called the Prudential Outfitting Company. The Prudential, it was a clothing store owned by Isaac Resnikoff. Now, we spoke about Isaac last week when I said he came in 1906 and started the first Zionist program in New London, major Zionist. But anyhow, he was the father of Izzy Resnikoff. So when you look up in the school yearbooks and see the advertisements, the quote was, "For the swellest clothes at the most reasonable prices, see Izzy." And of course, this was before he became the major real estate developer that we know him as. But anyhow, that was the Marcus store and of course the Prudential Outfitters. Now, this building though is actually the Lawrence Hall building, given to the city of New London by Joseph Lawrence or his sons. Now, there was a building here before by Lawrence, but this one was put up in 1901. Now, Lawrence Hall became, the second floor was a huge meeting hall. It's said that it could hold up to 1,200 people in the hall. And it was a major venue for New London. You'd have concerts there, exhibitions, lectures, very busy place, and professional boxing matches that I won't get to tonight, but we could talk about it next time. But how do you folks know the second floor of this building? As Simpson's Bowling Alley. It was before my day, but you all folks would all know that. This was Simpson's Bowling Alley, a duck pin bowling place that, was quite popular. I'm sure many of you would go there. But when Bank Street got rowdier and tougher, it became less of a great venue. There was minimal walk-in traffic after a while. So the only real business was the leagues. Now, the bowling leagues. The leagues can only be at night because men were working, and now women had entered the workplace also. So the women certainly weren't going to come down to Bank Street at night to go bowling. So what happened is the bowling alley then moved out to Waterford, became the Waterford Family Bowl, and right across from Stop and Shop. And then it also allowed Sam Rubenstein to use the space for more storage. So Simpson's Bowling Alley. Now, next door was the Metropolitan Hotel. The Metropolitan Hotel was built by liquor merchants, believe it or not, in 1855. And at the time, it was described in a quote as a pretentious, lavish waste of money. Okay, well, that was the old days. Now, how would you folks, the older New London people, know this store? You know it as Tarney's Toggery, a clothing store. This was the business of Isidore Tarnopol. And just to show, and which, again, I didn't know, but basically he moved his business out to New London Mall when that opened up. And after that, it became the second home of the Solomon stationery business. Their first home was on Main Street, then here, and then I believe they moved at that point up the street to their much bigger location. But to show you that I'm not totally crazy, if you look in the vestibule today, you'll see a T there for Tarney's, and many stores had their insignia in their doorways. So that was Tarney's. Now, next we get to talk about the Capitol Theater, major venue in New London. The Capitol Theater, this building was built in 1921 by a fellow named Walter Murphy. There was a previous theater there called the Aborn Hall that was built back in 1851, but that, I believe, burnt down. And then in 1921, they built this structure. This was the premier vaudeville house for New London. People like George Burns, Gracie Allen, Al Jolson, Jack Benny, all performed here. But then, unfortunately, as Bank Street deteriorated in the 70s, it then became an X-rated movie theater and finally closed in 1974. And I don't know if some of you can remember this, but this was the inside of the Capitol Theater. But also, this is after it starts to be run down. This is not when it was an open theater. Now, a couple things about this. First of all, you remember George Burns and Gracie Allen. Like I said, they performed here at this theater. Well, I'm going to now debunk an urban myth. You might read that Burns and Allen actually met here at the theater and began their romance in New London. Not true. Not true. It turns out that Gracie Allen, when she lived in New York, her roommate as a young actress was the future Mrs. Walter Murphy, the guy that built this building. So it was Mrs. Murphy that actually introduced Burns and Allen, probably in New York City or New Jersey, but not in New London. So that was our little urban myth there. But anyhow, one thing I found interesting, if you look at these buildings on this block, of course, the Capitol Theater is the tallest, but notice how each building steps up to reach the pinnacle of the Capitol building and the Capitol Theater in the middle of the block. Now, next, we're going to talk about the Lawrence Shea building. There were three Shea brothers in town, John, James, and Lawrence. They each had their own building, and they each put their name very prominently on the building. These were liquor dealers. This is, of course, before Prohibition, but they were liquor distributors and dealers. And on the first floor of each building was a saloon, and then they had their business upstairs. Now, the next building, which I'm going to talk about, the Royal Hotel, this began as the Bacon House. This was a hotel first built in, first built in the 1930s by the Bacon brothers, not the current Bacon brothers, but the Bacon brothers back then. And it was a stagecoach inn, very popular because it was a great stopping off point when you were traveling between New York and Boston. So this one burnt down to the ground in 1897, but it was rebuilt by a fellow named Fred Gavitt. And if you at the top, when you're on Bank Street, you'll see it says the Gavitt Building, 1897 up here. Now, Mr. Gavitt ran a very tight ship. He was a strict disciplinarian, didn't tolerate any disorderly conduct at his hotel. So I'm sure it was a very neat and clean establishment. You guys, at least in my days here, you would know the first floor as Ernie's Cafe. Now, on the end of the block is the bank building, one of the two banks on the street. This building started in 1807 as the New London Bank. And it was actually the second bank in New London. First one was the Union Bank. This made New London the first city in the state of Connecticut to actually have two banks. In 1905, it became when this building was put up, it was the New London City Bank. I'll show you here in 1905. And then it's been a whole gamut of banks. I mean, it was Shawmut in the 50s. When I came to town, I got my first mortgage here from the New London Federal Savings and Loan. And of course, now it's Liberty Bank. So if you're good with your Roman numerals, you can see that on this side, it says 1807 when the very first bank was established. And on the other side, it says 1905 when the current building was put up. Okay, now let's cross over to the other side of the street and start walking down the other side of Bank. Now, this building always fascinated me. One term could be the Cube building. Because if you look at it, there's one room on each floor, right? It's not a big wide building. It's a stacked up building. So it was a cube building. And again, on the first floor years ago, well, in recent years was Subway, but then it was other luncheonettes too. Now look at this. Here's a picture from the turn of the century. Look at the roof on the building. It had this exotic pointed roof. I could never find out what happened to that. Did it get blown off in a storm? Did they take it down? I don't know what happened to it, but that was the original roof on the building. Now, this is a great picture. This is a picture from the 60s. Now, look at this. This, first of all, here the roof is gone. The exotic roof is gone. The next building, which we know as Captain's Pizza, was always a restaurant. And you can see the red sign doesn't show up clearly, but says Skylark. That was the Skylark restaurant. Maybe some of you may remember that. This building we're going to talk about in a moment. The taller building was the John Shea building, one of the three liquor brothers I just mentioned. So he had his name up at the top. And this was the home of the Caruso Music Store for something like 32 years, and until they moved over to State Street. So here's the building that I wanted to mention. The purple side was the Western Union. The building on the left was the Western Union office for New London. That was a very important means of communication before the modern era, but that was Western Union. Now see the Oasis pub? This was originally, or at least at one point a long time ago, the New England Cigar and Tobacco Company. Well, that building, that business was taken over, I think in the 50s, by William Melman. William Melman is the father of Beth Kamazar and Rick Melman. And after he took over the business, he combined it with something called the Acme Automatic Vending Machine Company and moved out to Crystal Avenue. And you also may know Mr. Melman as the president and CEO of the Variety House in Groton. So all his businesses started in this little spot on Bank Street. Now, if you look up from that building, and I don't know how many people have noticed this, you see the three figureheads, mastheads, that to me, I believe is an homage to the seafaring days of Bank Street. But you'll see that just looking up on that building. Now, next is this building. The blue end would be the road, at least I remember it as the Roadhouse Cafe. Been many bars and restaurants here. But if you look behind it, there's a house. Here's another picture. There's a house here. So they built this whole frontage in front of the house. This was the Frick brothers' home, Adam and Andrew Frick. And they were a whaling business. They had a big wharf. They had their own wharf behind their house. And they had quite a business. In the old days, this was a big lawn they had on Bank Street, a big, beautiful lawn in front of their house. And it would be a meeting point for family, business associates, all sorts of folks. But then they built this whole commercial frontage. In the back of the building, there was a coopery or a cooperage. A cooperage is where you built the barrels and casks, which they needed for the whaling business. So they had their own building in the back for the barrels. Now, I also just recently learned that one of their wives actually brought a slave up here from Alabama in 1858, together with her children, for the sole purpose of freeing that slave. So at least they were involved in the emancipation business. Okay, next we talk about one of the fascinating buildings on the street. This is Muddy Waters, as we well know, but this building was put up on speculation in 1833. It was built because the owner at the time wanted it to be the U.S. Custom House. Well, unfortunately, the government didn't quite agree, and they built their custom house up the street. But the same year, 1833, this became the Whaling Bank. So Joseph Lawrence and his buddies got together and they had to put their money somewhere, so they formed the Whaling Bank. And that was the third bank in New London at that time. Well, it existed as a bank for many, like over 100 years. In fact, when they incorporated as the National Whaling Bank, in those days, they printed their own money. So here's a $2 bill from the National Whaling Bank. So what happened to the building? It was 1943, Benjamin Neistat bought the building and ran it and ran Thames Crockery there with his son Ephraim. That's Louise Neistat's husband. And they opened this business. And this lasted for many years until they moved the business elsewhere. And then the son, Barry Neistat, opened up Muggs and then finally Muddy Waters that we know of today. Of course, I think that's closing, but we'll leave that alone. Now, one interesting tidbit about the Neistats, since they own this building. Oh, by the way, think about this. The building only had two owners since 1833. First, it was the bank for over 110 years. And then the Neistat family owns the building. So only two owners all that time. Well, one little tidbit about the Neistat is this fellow, Louis Nye. Louis Nye was born as Louis Neistat in Hartford, and I believe was a nephew to Benjamin Neistat that started the business here. Well, Louis Nye, who's also related to the Schneiders, he was a very popular figure on the Steve Allen show, where his classic line was, "Hi-ho, Steve Areno." But if you remember also, Louis Nye was on the Beverly Hillbillies. You know, not many episodes, but he was on it enough. He was Sonny Drysdale, the son of the banker, Mr. Drysdale, who I guess was a bit of a playboy on the show. But anyhow, the show business aspect of the building continues because now Barry's son, Casey Neistat, is a showbiz phenomenon and a major player in the entertainment world. So anyhow, that's that building. Next door, this rather nondescript building was actually a store called the Basket Shop. Some of you may remember. They sold gifts and wickery, jewelry. And it was the store of Isidore Rogovin. That was the brother of Sam Rogovin. So that makes Sarah and Aaron Rogovin from Bethel their uncle. Okay, now as we continue, this building I also find interesting. This is right across from the bank at Golden Street. This building was always known for many years as the Lawrence Hospital building. It was called that because obviously the hospital had their offices here, but it was also part of the Lawrence whaling empire too, the Lawrence Company. Well, and if you look, the building was put up in 1790. So it's one of the oldest buildings on Bank Street, along with that Frick House I showed you back a few minutes ago. So this is from 1790. If you look at the store on the left over here, this was a saloon that was run by a fellow named Louis Elfenbein. Louis Elfenbein was the father of David Elfenbein, who owned the Ford dealership that was sold to Mr. Strocklitz, and also Aaron Elfenbein, the big lawyer in town, who was affectionately known as Bones. But anyhow, this was where the Elfenbein family got started. On the other side, where it says Otto's Barbershop, that was back in the 20s. That was the barbershop of Samuel Gipstein, the father of Edward Gipstein, our long-term cardiologist in town. And that makes him the grandfather of Rick Gipstein, the architect, and Todd Gipstein, that I'm sure you all know. So, but Sam was a major player in the barber world because he went up to Hartford, started the Connecticut Commission on barbers, and strove for very sanitary condition in the barbers world. Now, as we continue down the street, this building was known for many. This is called the Exchange, and it was basically the central headquarters of the Joseph Lawrence whaling firm. This was their big business. This was their spot. And, the firm, besides whaling, by the way, just as an aside, they also dealt with sealing, which means catching seals for the oil. And they also had a big shipping business all centered out of this building. There's another view, a front view of the building. Well, one interesting aspect of it, on the second floor was always the home of the Jaboom Club. The Jaboom Club was a fraternal order where these men had to either have gone on one whaling voyage or have spent 2 years at sea to become a member of the club. And every year they had a big parade on February 22nd. They idolized George Washington for some reason, and they always had a big parade on his birthday. Well, the club ended around 1959 or so, but this is the Flock Theater doing a mock-up of the Jaboom Club parade. So now the same building for many years in the mid 1900s was the Aben Hardware Company. Aben, like I mentioned last week, stood for Ben Kaplan, the founder of Congregation Bethel, and Abe Agranovich, Paul Agranovich's grandfather. They had this big hardware store. Now, this is a picture right after the hurricane of 38. If you notice, the third floor is now gone and it was never rebuilt. So this store, this store became, what they did is they moved across the street where the Olympic Sporting Goods store was, and we'll talk about that also in a second. But basically, this was the Aben Park hardware store. So now next to Aben was this little store, which was at one time was the Quick Service Electric Company. It was started by a fellow named Abraham Levinson, and it became basically an appliance repair. I'm mentioning it only, he ran it with his two sons, Edward and Benjamin Levinson, but their sister was Dorothy Levinson, who was, again, a very dear, very active member of Congregation Bethel. So this is where her father's business began. Next to that, this store is the Flavors of Life now, but this was the New London Lighting Fixture store. And it was owned by a fellow named Samuel Chertoff, who came here in 1918. He opened the showroom and then, expanded it to appliances and what have you. I mean, the only little tidbit about him is that his daughter married Alex Shapiro, who was a name I've always heard as a very popular dentist in town. And and then later, this business, this New England lighting business, was owned by a fellow in the 60s named Hyman Kirstein. I couldn't prove this. You guys can tell me otherwise, but I'm assuming that was the father of Ken Kirstein. And of course, now we talk about Roberts Audio and Video. This building was put up in 1960, and by the 1860, and by the 1880s, there's the other half. So the two parts were put up together, I believe. By the 1880s, it was the home of the A.B. Currier auction house. So you see here all the employees from the auction house standing out in front. The second floor was the first home of the New London Day. So these two guys over here probably are working for the Day, but that's the Day started in this building. Now, after the auction house moved out, it became the Darrow and Comstock ship chandlers again. So this was another chandlery to supply the shipping business. After the shipping business faded, Darrow and Comstock then became a hardware store, and that lasted until the 1960s. And here's a bill of sale from the original Darrow and Comstock. Now, what happened is a fellow named Robert Levinson, who I don't think was a relationship to the Dorothy Levinson family, started the Roberts Electric Shop in 1934. He actually started it where Hot Rods is today, and then moved into this much bigger building. And then his son Barry Levinson took it over until it was sold in the past 10 years or so. Now, next, I'm going to talk about this very important building, the Hygienic. The Hygienic was built in 1844, again, at the height of the whaling time, by a fellow named Captain Giles Harris, who was a whaling captain. Now, on the first floor was a grocery store, they sold ship's provisions, so basically the ship's chandlery. But the crew's quarters were upstairs. And eventually, as the whaling business died, this became a bit of a hotel. And I must say, in the 70s, I've heard rumors that you could actually rent rooms by the hour here too. But basically, this was the Hygienic. Now, from 1919 to 1985, there was a restaurant on the first floor. Well, I heard the name Hygienic was a bit of a misnomer because it wasn't the cleanest spot in town. But basically, it was a 24-hour restaurant that, was open to everyone. So it might have been good in the 40s, but maybe not so good in the 70s when you had all the craziness on Bank Street. Now, one thing about the restaurant, well, here's another picture of it. So what happened, it was really scheduled for demolition. But in 1996, a local arts group purchased it as a nonprofit organization and opened up the Hygienic Art Gallery. Now, back in the days of the delicatessen, look at the floor. Looks like swastikas. So so obviously in World War II, that floor got covered over, and you no longer see that at all. Now that's the Buckley House, but in between the Hygienic and the Buckley House was a building that was torn down to make the Hygienic Park that they have. And that was where the original building was for Kaplan Luggage and Umbrella. Well, Kaplan Luggage and Umbrella was Lewis Kaplan, and ultimately that morphed into Kaplan Travel. Now, the Buckley House, to me, has a lot of great history on Bank Street, or just for New London. It was built in 1790. Again, while everything is reviving after Benedict Arnold burnt the town down. Now, this was the home of Charles Buckley. Charles Buckley and his son Leonard lived there also, was a Revolutionary War soldier. He actually, it is said, sailed with the sea captain John Paul Jones at one point. But then he got into the rum importing business, working with the Caribbean, and he became very wealthy in that regard. But he died in his house. I don't have the year, but he died in his house, and the son died a year later. But these were wealthy men, so what their estate provided money for the Buckley School. So there would be a form of higher education in New London for boys. And it was also said about Charles Buckley that he witnessed the first unfurling of the Stars and Stripes in 1776. Now, this has been many buildings over the years. Look in the back, by the way. See the brick in the back? That was when it was Charles Clink's Meat Market. And this was considered probably the largest retail meat market in the state of Connecticut. He built that brick area in the back as his ice house so he can maintain, the freshness of the food. Now, many other buildings were there also besides Clink. You may have remembered it as the Salvation Army's family thrift store. But also, here's a picture from 1919. It was, I believe, the first home of Malov Jewelers. So that's Morris Malov on the right in that picture. Now, the next building was built originally as the Arnold Rudd Company. It was a grain store, a feed store. It was built in, let's see, I don't have the year, but basically it was a store, and it had an elevator. It was probably one of the first stores in New London to have an elevator. So what did it become ultimately? It became the Schwartz Furniture Company, which was very convenient to have an elevator when you're moving furniture. Now, also, I want to go back. I think I skipped over. This building is also rather interesting. You know this as the New London Antiques. You know it as Olympic Sporting Goods. But it was built way back in the early 1900s. And one of the first things that was in this building was the Thames Garage, 1909, because now you had automobiles coming in. Well, in 1916, it was a car dealership. They sold Maxwell's and White's and, you know, very, very early automobiles. But then look at the top of the building. Look at this insignia. I don't know if you recognize that or not, but that is the insignia for Montgomery Wards. This is their headquarters, the Spirit of Progress on top of their headquarters in Chicago. And this building on Bank Street was the first Montgomery Wards. It opened in 1929 and stayed there for 10 years until they built their modern or newer building on State Street. It stayed in Union Street, and then they moved out. And the various times, like I said, the Aben hardware store moved in. And just to finish up one more building, and another time we could talk about the rest of Bank Street. This building's next door to the Olympic Sporting Goods store. This was Kaplan's furniture store. And, you know, if you don't believe me again, there's the name Kaplan's in the vestibule. Just like Modern Electric over here says Modern Electric in the vestibule. So Kaplan's furniture was at this location, and eventually they moved across the street, and hopefully we could talk about that at another time. But, you know, it's 7:20 now, and I think I threw enough facts at you about Bank Street. There's a lot more to say because there's the whole second half of Bank Street leading up to the fire station, and then we go on to where Schneider Hardware was located, and that end of Bank Street. But that's for another day, and I thank you all for listening to my little talk, and maybe the next time you walk down Bank Street, you'll look up or look sideways, and you'll think about all these different little features that I mentioned tonight. So thank you all, and I will open it up, or Kathleen can open it up for any questions, and we'll see what everybody has to say.
Thank you so much, Stan. I am going to try to take you off the speaker view, right. And then we can see who's asking questions.
Okay.
And Ella, if you're on, could you unmute yourself and tell me how to do that?
Same as you did before. Just put your cursor on Stan's picture and it says cancel spotlight.
Okay.
Okay, so tell me, what questions might you all have about Bank Street, at least the part that we covered tonight? Or what can you add? What did I miss? What mistakes did I make? What personal insight do you have about all these places on Bank Street?
And when did the railroad go in?
Oh, yeah.
1852. 1852, and it was completed up to
No,
up to the river.
I unmuted.
Yep. And
Stan?
trolleys went in around the same time. Yeah.
Okay, the Kirstein building, when you were talking about the lighting building, that is Kenny Kirstein's father.
It is.
Who had it, yes.
Good.
Absolutely.
Oh, thanks, Lois. Yeah, I couldn't prove that. I couldn't find that information, but that made sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another piece of folklore is that there were so many
Jerry Fisher.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jerry.
So many Jewish merchants downtown that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, all of the stores closed.
Right.
Yep. Yep. The good old days. Yeah. Yep.
And they said that it was out of consideration for the Jews. But I think the reality was it was out of consideration for the fact that nobody would go downtown.
Right, Jerry.
No business is going on.
You didn't want to be seen. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Hey, Stan, Rick Melman.
Hey, Rick.
How are you?
Hello, Rick.
Was I accurate?
Oh, my gosh.
Hey, Mark.
Left your Uncle Bernie out.
What's that?
I say Stan left your Uncle Bernie out.
Stanley, I want to offer a little modification to the early history. To my recollection, the tobacco business was an ongoing business here in New London,
Right.
and it was operated by, I was told, the late Elfrida Bernstein's family.
Okay.
And my mother's, God bless her, my mother's father, Sam Smith, came from Hartford, bought that existing tobacco business in the late 40s, very early 50s.
Right.
And my mother had 3 other sisters, one of which was Anne Smith. Anne Smith married Bernie Richmond, and they moved from Hartford to help Sam Smith with the tobacco business. Bernie Richmond had developed leukemia and subsequently passed. My father then came down to help Grandpa. And in the early 50s, we moved from Hartford to New London.
Right.
So the business was ongoing, but the business also was owned by all the sisters. So my father was the working partner, and we won't get into all the history that developed.
Right. But that was,
we've all been through that.
Again?
And I think that Carl Stoner's father came to New London to roll cigars.
Really?
Okay.
Well, that would predate our involvement.
Yes, it would predate it. Yes.
Yeah. No, I believe the Bernsteins were the original. And then from that early spot on Bank, I remember we were a few doors down from Carlo's Italian restaurant. On
Marty's Furniture. You're at Marty's Furniture building.
We were in a very tall brick building.
Yeah.
I believe it too had some kind of lift involved. And then we moved to Church Street, which is now where the Radisson or Holiday Inn is.
Right. Right.
And
that was the old Sydney's building.
Yeah. And then we went to Crystal Avenue and the First Variety House.
It's not his brother either.
The First Variety House operated on Crystal Avenue, and then it went. Hello, who's talking? Okay. Is somebody else talking? Am I missing?
No, I muted him. Go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to say, everything started on Crystal Avenue, the big expansion with the tobacco business, and you know, indeed in those days the submarines all welcomed cigars and cigarettes on board, and as a kid I used to be able to go onto the base and go down into the submarines with our salesmen, and that was always fun. But those
do you have any stories, Stan, about Abe the Newsboy?
That's coming. Okay. Yes, I do. Because Abe the Newsboy was a professional boxer, Hollandersky, which I will talk about when we get to the Hollandersky building, which is Modern Electric. Right. But he was a professional fighter. And where did he fight?
Ocean Beach.
Ocean Beach, but also Lawrence Hall.
He fought in Lawrence Hall. He fought at Ocean Beach. But the record that he still holds is that he fought more sanctioned fights than any other boxer in American history, because he would take his boat to sell newspapers to all the Navy boats that would tie up to load up coal at the mouth of the Thames River. And when he got to the boat, he would challenge the boxing champion of the boat to a match. And the match was recorded. So Abe the Newsboy has this record of having fought more matches than any other boxer in professional boxing.
Right. I thought he was in the Navy also at one time. But yeah, we'll talk about him when we talk about the Hollanderskis from that building. I stopped there tonight. Yeah.
And the other thing, I don't think Carol Sandru is on the call tonight, but you should get a little bit about Carol Sandru's father and mother.
Well, the father I know. Yeah. Well, yeah, no,
the Irish Jewish
connection. Yeah.
Is amazing.
That was Huey's Ringside, I believe, the restaurant.
Right.
So we'll get to that another time. Yep.
And Kirk was on the Fulton on that submarine tender.
Right. Really?
Towards the end of its time.
Right.
It was, let's see, it would have been right about 1990.
Wow.
When you delivered our daughter Robin, he was on the Fulton. The other question I had was, did you ever hear about a liquor store, Solomon's liquor store? I had a great aunt, Aunt Bessie Solomon, who was actually a member of Bethel, and my niece is named for her. Vita's daughter.
Judy Solomon's was the liquor store was by the Buckley House.
Okay, that's what I was.
Because when we came to New London, my father got a job at American TV, which was right next door.
Okay.
And that was owned by Jerry Jacobs, Wendy Jacobs' father.
Okay, I was wondering where the liquor store was.
Right.
The other person, Stanley, that I want you to look into is Oscar Dane.
Oh, yeah. He had a business on where Lou Detz's building was.
Right. And Oscar Dane made radios for the Army.
Right. Templeton Radio Company, I believe.
And the folktale that I heard related to Zionism is that after World War II, he had so many surplus radios and he shipped them to Palestine.
Right.
There were actually one or two boats that left New London Harbor to get to Palestine to deliver armaments to the